The scream came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through the cold morning air of Veremore like a blade through silk. Elira did not scream with it. She never did. She stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by guards in silver armor, and said nothing at all, because she could not. Her hands were bound loosely at the wrists, more for show than for restraint, because everyone in that hall knew she would not fight back. She never fought back. That was the story they had told about her for 18 years, ever since she arrived in the pack as a small, frightened child who could not speak a single word. The council stood on a raised platform at the far end of the hall, 5 men and 2 women dressed in heavy furs, despite the warmth of the fire pits burning along the walls. At the center of them sat the new Alpha King, Damien Ashgrave, barely 3 months into his rule, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a scroll in his hands, rather than on the woman standing before him. He had not looked at her yet, not once. Elira watched him from across the hall, memorizing the shape of his face, the way a person memorizes the face of someone they will never see again. He was young for a king, not yet 30, with dark hair pushed back from a face that might have been kind once, before the crown had settled onto it and hardened everything beneath. "Elira of no house," said Lord Garrick, the oldest member of the council, reading from the same scroll that Damien held. His voice was thin and dry, the voice of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own authority. "Omega by blood, mute by curse or by nature, we cannot say which. The council finds that her presence weakens the strength of this pack and dilutes the purity of our bloodlines." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, some of it sympathetic, most of it not. Elira had lived among these people her whole remembered life, had scrubbed their floors and mended their clothes, and cared for their children when no one else wanted the job, and still she was a stranger to nearly all of them. An Omega did not speak, and so an Omega was rarely spoken to. She kept her chin level. She had learned long ago that if she let her eyes fall to the floor, people mistook it for shame, and she refused to give them that. "The sentence," Lord Garrick continued, "is banishment. Effective immediately, she is to be stripped of her packmark and escorted beyond the northern border, into the wildwood, where she will trouble this kingdom no further." Silence followed the word banishment, the particular silence of a room full of people pretending they were not relieved. Elira turned her head, just slightly, toward the throne. She wanted to see if the king would look up now, if he would meet her eyes even for a moment, before signing away the rest of her life. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she expected nothing from him, the same way she expected nothing from anyone in that hall. But some small, stubborn part of her still hoped. Damien's hand moved across the scroll. He signed his name without lifting his gaze, the quill scratching against parchment in the too quiet hall, and that was it. 18 years of her life, ended by 4 strokes of ink. "Take her to the border," he said, his voice low, almost bored. "See that she does not return." The guards stepped forward. One of them, a younger man, named Rowan, who had once let her share his portion of bread during a lean winter, would not meet her eyes as he took her arm. His grip was gentle, apologetic in a way his mouth could not be, because to speak kindly to a banished Omega in front of the council was its own kind of risk. They led her out through the great doors, down the stone steps, past rows of pack members who watched her go, with expressions ranging from pity to satisfaction. A few children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, too young to understand what banishment meant, only that something important and frightening was happening to the quiet woman who used to braid their hair. An older woman named Nora, who had served in the kitchens alongside Elira for years, broke from the crowd and pressed something small and hard into Elira's bound hands before a guard pulled her back. It was a flint stone, wrapped in a strip of cloth, and a tiny carved wolf that Elira recognized. She had made that wolf herself, years ago, and given it to Nora's daughter as a gift. "Be safe," Nora whispered, before the guard shoved her firmly aside. "Whatever you are, child, be safe. Whatever you are." The words followed Elira through the gates of Veremore and out onto the northern road, repeating themselves in her mind like a question she had never been allowed to ask about herself. The journey to the border took most of the day. The guards walked on either side of her, saying little, their pace brisk and businesslike, as if they wanted the unpleasant task finished as quickly as possible. Elira did not try to slow them down. She had learned patience, the way other people learned language, out of necessity, because a woman without a voice had no other tool with which to survive a world that preferred her silent. She thought of her earliest memory as they walked, the one that always came to her at the edges of sleep and never fully revealed itself. Smoke, the smell of burning wood, and something sharper underneath it. A woman's voice, calling a name that was not Alira, calling it over and over with increasing desperation, until the voice simply stopped. After that, nothing, until she woke in the arms of a Vermore patrol, who found her wandering the forest half frozen, unable to speak, unable to explain who she was or where she had come from. They had given her the name Alira because she wore it on a small pendant around her neck, the only thing she carried out of whatever had happened to her. The healers said the shock of whatever she had witnessed had taken her voice, that it might return one day, if the wound in her mind ever healed. It never had. 18 years, and not a single word had passed her lips. The pack had called her Omega, not because of any confirmed weakness in her blood, but because a silent child was an inconvenient child, and inconvenient children were easiest to categorize as lesser. She had grown up carrying that label like a stone in her pocket, heavy and constant, until she almost forgot there had ever been a time before it. By late afternoon, the guards stopped at the edge of a tree line, so dense and dark that the road itself seemed to hesitate before entering it. This was the border of the Wildwood, a place the pack told stories about to frighten children into obedience. Rogue wolves lived there, they said, and older things besides, creatures with no pack and no king and no law but their own hunger. "This is as far as we go," said the guard holding her arm, cutting the rope at her wrists with a single motion of his knife. The king's orders were clear. Beyond this point, you're no longer his concern. Alira rubbed at her freed wrists and looked past him, into the trees. The Wildwood did not look welcoming, but it did not look as monstrous as the stories claimed either. It looked, more than anything, like a place where no one would come looking for her, which after a lifetime of being watched and judged and found lacking, held its own strange appeal. Rowan lingered a moment after the others had already turned to leave. He glanced around to be sure no one was watching, then reached into his cloak and pulled out a small water skin and a wrapped bundle of bread, pressing them quickly into her hands. "I don't believe what they say about you," he murmured, so quietly she almost missed it. "I never did. I'm sorry it wasn't enough to matter." She looked at him for a long moment, and though she could not thank him with words, she inclined her head, a small, deliberate bow, the kind reserved for someone who had shown real kindness. It was the only currency she had left to give. Then the guards were gone, their footsteps fading back down the road toward Vermore, and Alira stood alone at the edge of the Wildwood, with nothing but a water skin, a bundle of bread, a flint stone, a carved wolf, and the vast unknown stretching out in front of her. She did not cry. She had learned not to, years ago, because tears required an audience willing to comfort them, and she had never had one. Instead, she tightened the strap of her small satchel across her shoulder, took one last look at the road that led back toward the only home she had ever known, and stepped into the trees. The Wildwood swallowed her within minutes. The canopy overhead grew thick enough to blot out most of the afternoon light, and the sounds of the outside world, the distant bleat of sheep, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low hum of pack life, all faded into a silence so complete, it felt like its own kind of language, one Alira understood better than any spoken word. She walked until her legs ached, following no particular path, only the instinct that told her to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the kingdom that had thrown her away. The trees here were older than any she had seen near Vermore, their trunks wide enough that 3 grown men could not have wrapped their arms around them, their roots rising up out of the earth like the bones of some enormous sleeping creature. As the light began to fail, Alira found a small hollow beneath the roots of one such tree, sheltered enough to keep out the wind, and settled in for the night. She ate a small portion of the bread Rowan had given her, saving the rest for later, and wrapped her cloak tightly around herself against the growing chill. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and low, and was answered by another, farther off. Alira sat very still, listening, waiting to feel afraid. But the fear did not come the way she expected. Instead, she felt something closer to recognition, as though the sound of those distant voices was calling to something buried deep inside her, something she had never been allowed to understand. She touched the pendant at her throat, the one small piece of her past that had traveled with her from wherever she had come from, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself wonder who she really was, and why the shape of that howl in the darkness made her chest ache with a longing she could not name. Sleep came slowly, pulling her under in pieces, and just before it took her completely, she thought she heard a voice, faint and far away, calling a name, not Illyra. The other name, the one from her earliest memory, the one that had disappeared into smoke 18 years ago and never returned. She did not know, as she drifted into an uneasy sleep beneath the roots of that ancient tree, that the banishment she had just suffered was not an ending at all. It was the first step of a much longer journey, one that would lead her back to Vermore someday, not as a silent Omega dragged out through the gates in shame, but as someone the entire kingdom, including the king who had signed her exile without ever once looking her in the eye, would learn to fear and to follow. For now, though, she was simply a woman alone in the dark, wrapped in a thin cloak, breathing in the cold night air of a forest that had swallowed better and worse than her before, waiting to see what the wildwood intended to do with the life it had just been handed. Morning would come, as it always did, and with it, the next part of a story that had already begun the moment a young king failed to look up from his scroll and see, even for a moment, the woman he was casting out into the unknown. Illyra woke to the sound of birds, hundreds of them, filling the canopy above her with a chorus so loud it startled her fully awake within seconds. For a moment she forgot where she was, her body still expecting the familiar creak of the servants' quarters back in Vermore. Then the cold air and the smell of damp earth reminded her, and the memory of the previous day settled over her like a second cloak. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping curled against the roots of the tree, and reached for the remaining bread in her satchel. It was harder than the night before, the edges beginning to dry, but she ate it anyway, chewing slowly, listening to the forest wake up around her. The wildwood in daylight looked nothing like the stories she had grown up hearing. There was no menace in the way the sunlight broke through the leaves in soft, scattered patches, no sense of watching eyes in the undergrowth. It looked, if anything, peaceful, older and quieter than the kingdom she had left behind, as though the trees themselves had seen enough centuries pass that human affairs no longer troubled them. She rose and continued walking, unsure of her destination but unwilling to sit still. Movement gave her purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping the full weight of what had happened from crushing her entirely. She followed a narrow stream for much of the morning, letting its sound fill the silence, occasionally kneeling to drink from its clear, cold water. By midday, the ground began to slope upward, the trees thinning slightly to reveal the crumbling remains of old stonework scattered among the roots. Illyra paused, running her fingers over a broken pillar half swallowed by moss. Someone had built here once, long before the wildwood had claimed it back. Faint carvings still marked the stone, worn nearly smooth by time, but she could make out the shape of a wolf's head, its jaws open in a silent howl, wreathed in what looked like flames. She had never seen a symbol like it before. Vermore's crest was a simple silver wolf, on a field of blue, plain and unadorned. This carving felt older, wilder, as though it belonged to a kingdom that had existed long before Vermore ever drew its first borders. Curiosity pulled her forward, deeper into the ruins. She found the outline of what must have once been a grand structure, its walls mostly collapsed, its roof entirely gone, open now to the sky. In the center stood a stone altar, cracked down the middle, with the same wolf and flame symbol, carved into its surface, larger and more detailed than the one on the pillar. She was so absorbed in studying the carving that she did not hear the footsteps behind her, until a voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Illyra spun around, her heart lurching, to find an old woman standing at the edge of the ruined structure, leaning on a gnarled wooden staff. The woman's hair was white and long, braided down her back, and her eyes, a pale, striking gray, studied Illyra with an intensity that made her want to step back. Illyra raised her hands, palms open, the universal gesture of someone meaning no harm. She could not explain herself with words, and for a terrible moment she feared this stranger would demand answers she had no way to give. But the old woman only tilted her head, studying her more closely, her gaze moving from Illyra's face down to the pendant resting against her collarbone. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, and then something closer to disbelief. "Where did you get that?" the woman asked, her voice sharper now, urgent. When Alira did not answer, only touched the pendant self-consciously, the old woman stepped closer, ignoring every instinct that should have told her to be cautious around an armed, silent, and possibly dangerous stranger in the ruins. "You cannot speak," the woman said slowly, understanding dawning across her weathered face. It was not a question. "How long?" Alira held up both hands, then closed and opened them once more, an old gesture she had developed over the years to indicate a large, indefinite number. Since childhood. Since always, as far as she knew. The old woman was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a scholar studies a rare and unexpected discovery. "My name is Edda," she finally said. "I have lived in these woods longer than the kingdom of Veremore has stood at all. And I have not seen a mark like the one hidden beneath your collar in over 20 years. Alira frowned, confused, and Edda gestured for her to step closer, pulling back the edge of Alira's collar, with surprising gentleness, before Alira could protest. Beneath her collarbone, faint and silver, nearly invisible unless the light struck it exactly right, was a small mark shaped like a flame wrapped around a wolf's head, the same symbol carved into the stone altar behind them. Alira had seen that mark countless times in her life, always dismissing it as a birthmark, something unremarkable that she had stopped noticing years ago. She stared down at it now, as though seeing it for the first time, and then back up at the ruins around them, the same symbol staring back at her from every broken stone. "You do not know what you are," Edda said quietly, not unkindly. "That does not surprise me. Whoever hid you did their work thoroughly." She lowered herself onto a fallen block of stone, with the careful movements of someone whose joints had grown tired, over many long years, and gestured for Alira to sit as well. "Sit, child. This will take some time to explain, and I suspect you have nowhere else to be." Alira hesitated only a moment before sitting across from her, the pendant now feeling heavier around her neck than it ever had before. "Long before Veremore existed," Edda began, "there was another kingdom in these lands, older and some would say greater. Its people were called the Ember Wolves. They were not simply strong fighters or clever hunters. They carried something rarer, a bloodline that gave certain among them the power to command, not through cruelty or force, but through voice and presence alone. A true Ember Wolf could speak a single word and turn the tide of a battle, calm a riot, or bring an entire pack to kneel, not out of fear, but out of an ancient, undeniable pull, written into the blood of every wolf who heard them. Alira listened, hardly breathing, as Edda continued. "The Ember Wolf line was hunted to near extinction generations ago. Kingdoms feared what they could not control, and a bloodline capable of commanding loyalty without effort was the greatest threat any throne could imagine. The last known Ember Wolves vanished from record more than 2 decades past. I always believed the line had ended entirely." Edda reached out and touched the pendant at Alira's throat with 2 fingers, careful and reverent. "Until now." Alira shook her head slowly, disbelief plain on her face. She was no commander, no powerful bloodline reborn. She was an Omega, a mute servant, a woman so unremarkable that an entire kingdom had cast her out without a second thought. "I understand your doubt," Edda said, reading her expression easily. "But doubt does not change what runs in your blood." "Your silence, child. I do not believe it is natural. I believe someone placed it upon you deliberately, a curse woven tight enough to hide the truth of what you are, likely to protect you from those who would have hunted you down as an infant, the way they hunted the rest of your bloodline." The forest around them seemed to grow very quiet, as though even the birds had paused to listen. Alira thought of the smoke in her earliest memory, the voice calling a name that was not Alira, the desperation in it before it simply stopped. Perhaps that voice had belonged to someone protecting her. Perhaps the silence that had defined her entire life, the silence that had made her an outcast, the silence that had gotten her banished from the only home she had ever known, had never been a weakness at all. Perhaps it had been a shield. "If you are willing," Edda said, watching her carefully, "I can help you understand what was done to you, and perhaps, in time, undo it. It will not be easy. Curses of this kind are woven from grief and sacrifice, and breaking them often demands the same. But I do not believe it is a coincidence that you walked into these ruins today, on the very day the kingdom that discarded you cast you out into these woods." She smiled faintly, the expression softening the sharp lines of her face. "I believe you were always meant to find your way back here." Elira looked down at the pendant in her hand, then up at the crumbling stones surrounding them. The wolf and flame symbol repeated over and over in the old carvings, like a message finally being delivered after 20 years of silence. For the first time, since the guards had let her out of Vermore's great hall, something other than grief stirred in her chest. It was small and uncertain, but it was there, a flicker of something that might, in time, grow into purpose. She looked up at Etta and nodded, once, firmly. Whatever waited for her in this forest, whatever truth had been buried beneath 18 years of silence and shame, she was ready to find it. Etta's home was a small stone cottage built into the side of a hill, half hidden by ivy and old moss, so well blended into the landscape that Elira nearly walked past it without noticing. Inside, shelves lined every wall, crowded with dried herbs, cracked pottery, and stacks of brittle, hand-copied scrolls that looked older than Vermore itself. "Sit," Etta said, gesturing toward a low wooden stool near the hearth. "What I am about to show you cannot be rushed, and it cannot be forced. It will take time, patience, and more courage than most people ever have to find." Elira sat, watching as Etta moved through the cottage gathering items: a small clay bowl, a bundle of dried silver leaves, a stone the color of dark amber that seemed to catch the firelight and hold it. She arranged them carefully on a low table between them, then settled onto a cushion across from Elira, with the deliberate care of someone preparing for a task she had performed many times before, though clearly not in many years. "The silence placed on you," Etta explained, "was not simple magic. It was built from memory, likely the very memory of the night your family was taken from you. Grief is a powerful binding agent. Whoever cast this curse used your own trauma as the lock, which means the key to breaking it lies in the same place." She looked up, her gray eyes steady. "You will need to remember that night fully, not in fragments, as you have carried it until now, but completely. I will guide you, but you must be the one to walk through it." Elira's hands tightened in her lap. The memory she carried was already painful in its incompleteness. The smoke, the voice calling a name, the silence that followed. The thought of facing it fully, of watching whatever had happened unfold from beginning to end, filled her with a dread deeper than anything she had felt walking out of Vermore's gates. But she had spent 18 years running from that night without even realizing it, hiding behind silence, because some deep, unspoken part of her had always understood that the alternative was unbearable. She thought of Lord Garrick's voice, reading her sentence aloud, of the pack members who had never once tried to learn who she truly was, of a king who could not be bothered to lift his eyes from a scroll. She had nothing left to lose by finally looking backward instead of only forward. She nodded. Etta lit the amber stone with a small flame from the hearth, and a warm, honeyed scent filled the cottage, calming and heavy. "Close your eyes," she instructed gently. "Breathe slowly. I will be here the entire time. You are not walking into that night alone this time." Elira closed her eyes and let the scent fill her lungs, let Etta's low, steady voice guide her breathing, until the edges of the cottage around her began to soften and fade, replaced slowly, piece by piece, by the shape of a memory she had spent her whole life avoiding. She was small again, no older than 4, standing in the doorway of a wooden house she did not recognize but somehow knew intimately. Outside, the night sky glowed orange, not with stars but with fire, the flames climbing high enough to blot out everything beyond them. She could hear shouting, distant and frantic, voices she did not know calling out warnings that came too late. A woman knelt in front of her, her face streaked with soot and tears, her hands trembling as she fastened a pendant around the child's neck, the very pendant Elira still wore around her own throat 2 decades later. "Listen to me," the woman said, her voice shaking but fierce. "Whatever happens tonight, you must not speak. Not your name, not where you came from, not what you are. Do you understand me, Vela? You must be silent, and you must survive." Vela. The name struck something deep inside Elira, a recognition so total it felt like a physical blow. That was her name. Not Elira, the name given to her by strangers who found her wandering half-frozen in the woods, but Vela, the name her mother had spoken with such desperate love in the final moments before everything was taken from them both. The memory continued, relentless now that it had finally been allowed to unfold. Men in dark armor bearing no crest, Elira recognized, broke through the door, their weapons drawn, their faces set with grim purpose. Her mother pushed her behind a fallen beam, whispering the same instruction over and over, "Be silent, be silent, be silent," as though the words themselves could form a shield strong enough to protect her. What happened next came to Elira only in fragmented impressions, too painful and too fast for her young mind to have processed fully, even in the moment it occurred. Shouting, the clash of steel, her mother's voice, rising once more, calling her name, Viela. One final desperate time, before the sound cut off entirely, swallowed by the roar of collapsing timber and consuming flame. Elira, no, Vela, had run. She remembered that now, the small, terrified feet carrying her out through a gap in the burning wall, into the cold night forest beyond, running until her legs gave out and the world went dark around her. The next thing she remembered, the true beginning of her life as Elira, was waking in the arms of Vermore's patrol, unable to speak a single word, the silence her mother had commanded settling over her so completely that it never lifted again. Elira gasped and opened her eyes, tears streaming freely down her face, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Etta was there immediately, steady hands on her shoulders, grounding her back in the present, in the small warm cottage, far from that burning house. "You remember," Etta said softly. It was not a question. Elira nodded, her whole body shaking with the weight of what had just returned to her. Her mother's voice, her true name, the desperate final act of love that had cost a woman everything to protect her child. A curse of silence cast not out of cruelty but out of fierce, sacrificial devotion. She had spent 18 years believing her silence was a flaw, a weakness that made her lesser in the eyes of everyone around her. She understood now that it had been a gift, the last gift her mother had ever given her, and it had saved her life exactly as intended. "Your name," Etta said gently, "your true name, is Viela. It carries power of its own, more than you likely realize. Names given at birth within the Emberwolf bloodline are not simply words. They are woven into the very magic that defines who you are." She reached out and took both of Elira's hands in her own weathered ones. "The curse your mother placed was meant to protect you until you were strong enough and safe enough to reclaim what she gave you. I believe that time may finally be here." Elira, who would soon learn to answer once more to the name Viela, looked down at her own hands, remembering the small, trembling ones of the child in her memory, remembering her mother's fierce, desperate love in the final moments of her life. The pain of that memory would not fade quickly. She understood that grief this old and this deep did not simply disappear because it had finally been faced. But beneath the pain, something else had begun to stir, something that felt, for the very first time in her life, like the beginning of strength, rather than the confirmation of weakness. She had been cast out of Vermore as a silent, unworthy Omega, but the truth Etta had just helped her uncover told a very different story, one of a bloodline nearly erased from history, of a mother's final act of protective magic, of a name spoken in love just before everything was lost. Whatever waited for her beyond the walls of this small cottage, whatever trials or dangers the wildwood still held in store, Elira understood now that she was not simply surviving anymore. She was remembering who she had always been meant to become. Etta rose slowly and moved to the hearth, adding another small log to the fire, before returning to sit across from her once more. "The memory returning is only the first step," she said. "The curse still holds your voice bound, weakened now, but not broken. To fully reclaim it, you will need to prove yourself worthy of the bloodline that gave it to you in the first place. The wildwood itself holds trials, old and dangerous, meant to test exactly that kind of worth. Very few who attempt them survive." Elira, still trembling slightly from the weight of everything she had just relived, met the old woman's steady gray eyes and felt something settle inside her, quiet and resolute. She had already survived a burning house, an entire childhood of silence and shame, and a banishment from the only home she had ever known. She did not intend to stop now, not when the truth of who she truly was had finally, after 18 long years, begun to make itself known. "Rest tonight," Etta said, seeing the exhaustion etched plainly across the younger woman's face. "Tomorrow, we begin preparing you for what comes next. The trials will not wait forever, but they will wait until morning." Elira nodded, and for the first time since the guards had led her out through Vermore's gates, She allowed herself to feel something other than grief or fear. She allowed herself, cautiously, to feel hope. Morning in the wildwood arrived slowly, gray light filtering through the mist that clung low to the ground around Etta's cottage. Alira woke to the smell of something warm cooking over the hearth, and for a strange, disorienting moment, she almost forgot where she was, half expecting the sounds of the Vermore kitchens instead of the quiet rustle of leaves outside a stranger's window. Etta was already awake, stirring a pot of something that smelled of roots and herbs, her white braid falling over one shoulder as she worked. She glanced up when Alira stirred and offered a small nod of greeting before returning to her task. "Eat first," she said. "What I intend to teach you today will drain more from you than you expect." Alira sat up and accepted the bowl offered to her, grateful for the warmth of it against the cool morning air. She ate in silence, as she always did, though the silence felt different now, less like a wall, and more like a held breath, waiting for the moment it would finally be allowed to break. The trials of the wildwood, Etta explained once they had both finished eating, were built long ago by the Emberwolf line itself, a way of testing whether an heir was ready to carry the full weight of their bloodline's power. There are 3 trials, each tied to a different truth an Emberwolf must hold within themselves: instinct, sacrifice, command. She held up 3 fingers, folding one down with each word. Fail any one of them, and the forest does not forgive gently. Alira raised an eyebrow, silently asking what that meant, and Etta's expression grew more serious. Many who attempted these trials in generations past did not return, she said plainly. I will not lie to you about the danger, but I also do not believe you were led to these woods, on this particular day, entirely by chance. I have lived here for decades, child, longer than I care to admit, and I have never once stumbled upon someone carrying the mark you carry. That is not coincidence. That is fate making itself known. Alira considered this, turning the flint stone Nora had given her over in her fingers, a small, grounding habit she had already developed since arriving in the wildwood. She thought of the 18 years she had spent believing herself unworthy, weak, and lesser than everyone around her. She thought of the guards leading her out through Vermore's gates, without a single member of the council sparing her more than a passing glance. She was tired, she realized, of being underestimated. If these trials offered even the smallest chance of reclaiming the voice that had been stolen from her, the voice her own mother had sacrificed everything to protect, then she intended to take it, whatever the cost. She nodded firmly, and Etta's weathered face softened into something like pride. Then we begin with instinct, the old woman said. Come, there is a place not far from here, older even than my memory, where the first trial waits. They walked for nearly an hour through increasingly dense forest, the trees growing taller and more twisted the deeper they went, until they reached a wide, shallow valley, ringed by jagged stone outcroppings. In the center of the valley stood a lone, ancient tree, its bark blackened, as though scorched by fire long ago, though new green leaves still grew from its highest branches. This is the hollow of instinct, Etta explained, stopping at the valley's edge. The trial itself is simple to describe, though not simple to survive. You must reach the tree at the center and touch its trunk before the sun crosses fully overhead. The valley will not make that easy. Alira looked around the seemingly empty valley, seeing nothing immediately threatening, only rock and grass and the distant tree. She glanced back at Etta, silently asking what danger she meant. The valley tests instinct because it strips away everything else, Etta said. Once you step past this edge, you will not be able to see, hear, or feel anything beyond your own body. No sight, no sound, no scent to guide you. You must find your way to the tree, using only the instinct buried deep in your blood, the same instinct that allows an Emberwolf to sense truth and danger, without needing eyes to confirm it. If you rely on panic instead of trust, the valley will lead you in circles until the sun sets, and you will fail. Alira swallowed hard, staring at the innocent-looking stretch of grass and stone before her. It did not look dangerous. That, she suspected, was precisely the point. I cannot walk this path with you, Etta said gently. No one can. This trial must be faced entirely alone, but I will be here when you return, however long it takes. Alira took a slow breath, steadying herself, and stepped past the valley's edge. The change was immediate and disorienting. One moment she could see the grass beneath her feet, the stone outcroppings ringing the valley, the distant blackened tree. The next, everything went dark. Not the darkness of closed eyes, but a deeper, more absolute absence, as though her sight itself had simply ceased to function. She could not hear the wind moving through the grass, could not smell the damp earth beneath her feet, could not feel the texture of the ground she stood on. Panic rose immediately, sharp and instinctive, her mind screaming at her to turn back, to reach for the edge she could no longer locate. She forced herself to stop moving, to breathe, to remember Eda's words, trust, not panic. She closed her eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute darkness, and tried to quiet the frantic noise of her own fear. Somewhere beneath that fear, she reasoned, there had to be something else, some instinct passed down through a bloodline she had only just begun to understand. She thought of the wolf howl she had heard her first night in the wildwood, the way it had called to something deep inside her chest that she could not name at the time. She let that same feeling rise now, reaching for it the way she might reach for a hand in the dark. Slowly, tentatively, she became aware of something, not sight or sound exactly, but a pull, faint and steady, like a thread tied somewhere deep inside her, that tugged gently toward a single direction. She took a step forward, trusting the pull, and felt it strengthen slightly. Another step, and it grew clearer still. She kept walking, resisting the urge to second-guess herself, to reach out blindly for confirmation her mind desperately wanted but could not have. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. She had no way of knowing how long she walked, whether minutes or hours had passed, only that the pull inside her chest continued to guide her steadily forward. At one point, the pull shifted sharply, urging her to veer left, when every instinct born of simple logic told her to continue straight ahead. She hesitated, torn between trusting the strange new sense and trusting the more familiar reasoning of her mind. She thought of her mother's voice in the memory Eda had helped her recover. Be silent, be silent, be silent. An instruction that had made no logical sense to a frightened child, but had ultimately saved her life. She trusted the pull and veered left. Moments later, without warning, her outstretched hand met rough, scorched bark. Sight and sound returned to her all at once, overwhelming in their sudden clarity. She stood at the base of the ancient tree, her palm pressed flat against its blackened trunk, the sun directly overhead, not yet fully crossed, to the other side of the sky. She had made it. Relief flooded through her, so intense her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She sank down against the base of the tree, breathing hard, tears of exhaustion and disbelief pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had trusted something inside herself she had never known existed, something beyond logic or fear, and it had led her true. When she finally made her way back to the valley's edge, Eda was waiting exactly where she had left her, though the old woman's expression had shifted from careful patience to quiet, unmistakable satisfaction. You trusted it, Eda said, more to herself than to Alira, as though confirming something she had suspected but not been certain of. Most do not on the first attempt. That instinct will only grow stronger from here, if you continue to trust it as you did today. Alira allowed herself a small, exhausted smile, the first genuine one to cross her face in longer than she could remember. She had survived the first trial. 2 remained, and she suspected, based on the old woman's earlier warnings, that they would demand far more of her than instinct alone. But for the first time in her life, standing at the edge of that strange and ancient valley, Alira did not feel like the silent, unworthy Omega Vermore had cast out. She felt, however faintly, like someone capable of becoming exactly what her bloodline had always intended her to be. Eda placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as they turned to walk back toward the cottage. Rest well tonight, she said. Tomorrow, we face sacrifice, and that trial does not forgive hesitation, the way instinct sometimes does. Alira nodded, tucking the warning away alongside the quiet, growing certainty that had begun to take root inside her since the moment she first entered these woods. Whatever waited for her next, she intended to meet it with the same trust that had carried her through the darkness of the valley, one careful, deliberate step at a time. The second trial waited in a place Eda called the Hollow of Sacrifice, deeper into the wildwood than Alira had yet traveled, past a ridge of stone that marked what Eda described as the true heart of the ancient Emberwolf lands. They walked for the better part of a day to reach it, and with every mile, Alira felt the weight of anticipation growing heavier in her chest. This trial is different from the last, Eda explained as they walked. her staff tapping a steady rhythm against the forest floor. Instinct tests what lies within you already. Sacrifice tests what you are willing to release. The two are not the same, and many who pass one easily still fail the other. Illyra glanced sideways at her, silently asking what exactly the trial required. I do not know precisely, Edda admitted. The trial shapes itself differently for each person who faces it, drawing on what matters most to them individually. I only know its nature, not its specific form. You will discover that for yourself. They reached the hollow, as the afternoon sun began to slant lower through the trees, casting long shadows across a wide clearing, bordered by standing stones, arranged in a loose circle. At the center of the clearing sat a shallow pool of water, so still and clear, it looked more like glass than liquid, reflecting the sky above with unsettling perfection. Step into the circle, Edda instructed, and look into the water. The trial will begin from there. Illyra crossed the clearing slowly, the standing stones seeming to watch her approach with an attentiveness that made the hair on her arms rise. She knelt at the edge of the pool and looked down into its glassy surface, expecting to see her own reflection staring back. Instead, the water shimmered and shifted, and an image formed within it that was not a reflection at all. She saw Vermore, the great hall where she had been sentenced, the council seated on their raised platform. But the scene playing out before her was different from the memory she carried. In this version, Damien Ashgrave stood at the center of the hall, not as king passing judgment, but bound and helpless, surrounded by the same council members who had once condemned her. Lord Garrick's voice rang out, cold and final, sentencing the young king to the same banishment Illyra herself had suffered. The image shifted again, and Illyra understood, with sudden and unsettling clarity, what the water was showing her. A choice. She could see it forming in the vision, even as she watched, a fork in some future path not yet walked. She could return to Vermore one day with the full strength of her reclaimed bloodline, and she could choose vengeance, could see the same king who signed her exile without ever meeting her eyes, suffer exactly as she had suffered. The water rippled once more, and a second path unfolded. In this one, she saw herself standing beside Damien rather than against him, the kingdom rebuilding around them both, changed and strengthened rather than torn apart by retribution. It looked harder somehow, more uncertain, offering no clean, satisfying justice for the years of cruelty she had endured. The trial's demand became clear to her then, settling into her chest with quiet, unwelcome weight. She had to choose, here and now, which future she was willing to sacrifice. Not simply imagine, but truly release. One possibility in favor of the other, and the water would know if her choice was genuine, or merely spoken to satisfy the trial. Illyra thought of her mother's final words, the desperate love in them, be silent, be silent, be silent, an instruction born not of cruelty, but of fierce protection. She thought of Rowan's quiet kindness at the border, of Nora's small carved wolf pressed into her bound hands. Even within a kingdom that had failed her so completely, she had found scattered pieces of genuine goodness. She thought, too, of the anger still burning quietly beneath her grief, the memory of Damien's eyes fixed on his scroll rather than on her face, as he signed away her life without hesitation. That anger felt righteous, earned, and some deep, wounded part of her wanted desperately to see it satisfied. But satisfaction, she realized as she knelt at the edge of that still, watching pool, was not the same as healing. Vengeance might feel like justice in the moment, but it would not undo the years of silence and shame she had carried, would not bring back the family she had lost in that burning house so long ago. It would only add more wreckage to a kingdom already broken by cruelty and fear. She closed her eyes and, with a steadiness that surprised her, released the vision of vengeance entirely, letting it dissolve like mist, even as some small part of her mourned the satisfaction it might have offered. When she opened her eyes, the water had gone still and clear once more, reflecting nothing but the sky above, and a soft warmth spread outward from her chest, radiating down through her arms and settling finally into her throat. She gasped, one hand flying to her collarbone, feeling something shift there, subtle but unmistakable, like a lock finally beginning to turn after years of resistance. Edda, watching from the edge of the circle, stepped forward with an expression of quiet astonishment. "What did you release?" she asked softly. Illyra could not yet answer with words, but she pressed a hand to her own chest and then extended it outward, toward the direction of Vermore, before slowly closing her fingers into a fist and letting them fall open again, empty. A gesture of release, of choosing to let go of something she might have clung to. Edda's eyes softened with understanding. "Vengeance," she said quietly. "You let go of vengeance." She reached out and took Alira's hand, studying the younger woman's face with something close to reverence. "That is no small sacrifice, child. Many who face this trial cling to their anger long after it has stopped serving them. Choosing to release it, truly release it, rather than simply suppress it, is one of the hardest sacrifices this trial can demand." Alira felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. The anger had not disappeared entirely. She suspected it never would completely. But she had chosen, deliberately and consciously, not to let it define whatever future waited for her beyond these woods. As they made their way back toward Edda's cottage in the fading evening light, Alira noticed her own breathing had changed, subtly, but distinctly, as though something long constricted had finally begun to loosen. She still could not speak, not yet, but for the first time in 18 years, she felt the shape of words forming somewhere deep in her chest, waiting patiently for the moment they would finally be allowed to emerge. Edda seemed to notice the change as well, glancing at her with quiet satisfaction as they walked. "One trial remains," the old woman said. "Command. It will likely prove the most difficult of the three, for it asks you to fully embrace the very power your bloodline was hunted for possessing. Many are comfortable with instinct. Many can manage sacrifice, however painfully. But command requires you to accept authority over others, to trust yourself enough to lead, and that is a burden not everyone is willing to carry, even when they are capable of it." Alira considered this as they walked, thinking of the silent, overlooked Omega she had been for 18 years, dismissed and underestimated by everyone around her. The idea of commanding anything, let alone an ancient and powerful bloodline's full authority, felt almost absurd against the weight of that history. But she had already trusted an instinct she did not fully understand to guide her through absolute darkness. She had already released an anger that had felt, until today, like an inseparable part of who she was. Perhaps, she thought, command was simply the next step in a journey that had already asked far more of her than she once believed herself capable of giving. She would face it, whatever form it took, with the same steady resolve that had carried her through the first two trials. She had come too far now to turn back. The final trial waited 3 days after the second, a delay Edda insisted upon despite Alira's visible impatience. "Command cannot be rushed," the old woman had said firmly. "You must rest, and let what you released in the last trial fully settle before you face what comes next." Alira spent those 3 days helping Edda gather herbs, repair the cottage's aging roof, and, in quiet, unspoken moments, simply sitting with the strange new stillness that had settled over her since releasing her anger at the pool. She found herself watching the forest differently now, noticing details she might have missed before, the particular way light fell through certain leaves, the subtle shifts in birdsong that seemed to signal changes in weather before they arrived. On the morning of the third day, Edda led her to a place unlike either of the previous trial sites, a wide clearing at the edge of a rocky outcropping overlooking a valley, thick with untamed forest. A pack of wolves, real, living wolves, rather than any construct of the trial, moved through the trees far below, their forms just visible from this height. "This is the Hollow of Command," Edda explained. "Unlike the previous trials, this one requires a living audience. Wolves of the wildwood, wild and belonging to no pack, sense true bloodline authority instinctively. If your claim to the Ember Wolf line is genuine, and if you can find the voice to express it, they will recognize it. If not..." She left the sentence unfinished, though her meaning was clear enough. Alira looked down at the distant pack, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had spent 18 years without a voice at all. The idea that she might need to command an entire pack of wild, untamed wolves through voice and presence alone felt like an impossible leap from where she currently stood. "The curse is not fully broken," Edda continued, "but I believe it has weakened enough, after the sacrifice you made at the pool, that something may finally break through, if you find the strength to push against it. This trial will demand everything you have left. There is no partial success here. Either the pack recognizes your authority, or it does not, and an unrecognized claim in front of a wild pack carries its own significant danger." Alira swallowed hard. understanding the warning beneath Edda's careful words. If she failed this final trial, she might not survive to attempt it again. You do not have to attempt this today, Edda offered gently, seeing the fear plain on the younger woman's face. The trial will wait as long as you need it to. But Alira shook her head firmly. She had already faced absolute darkness, and released an anger that had defined her for years. She would not turn back now, not when the truth of who she was, the truth her own mother had died protecting, waited just beyond this final test. She stepped forward to the edge of the outcropping, and looked down at the distant pack, taking a slow, steadying breath. Edda placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Whatever happens, the old woman said quietly, know that finding your way here, remembering your name, releasing your anger, these were not small victories. Whatever the pack decides today, you have already proven more strength than most ever will. Alira nodded, grateful for the words even as her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. Edda withdrew, leaving her alone at the edge of the outcropping, and Alira began the careful, winding path down toward the valley floor. The descent took nearly an hour, the terrain steep and uneven, and by the time she reached the valley floor, the wolves had already noticed her approach. They gathered at a distance, perhaps a dozen of them, large and lean, their eyes tracking her every movement with wary, assessing attention. These were not pack wolves accustomed to human presence. They belonged to no kingdom, followed no crown, answered to nothing but the ancient rhythms of the wildwood itself. Alira stopped a careful distance away, her hands open and visible at her sides, and looked out at the assembled pack. She thought of everything Edda had taught her over the past days, of the mother who had sacrificed her voice to protect her, of the trials she had already survived through trust and sacrifice rather than force. Command, she realized, watching the wolves watch her in return, would not come from demanding their obedience. It would come from something deeper, something that required her to finally, fully release the silence she had carried for 18 years. She closed her eyes, reaching inward, toward the place where Edda had told her the curse still lingered, weakened, but not entirely broken. She felt it there, a tight, constricting knot somewhere deep in her chest, the same silence her mother had woven from love and desperation on the worst night of both their lives. She thought of her mother's voice, the last thing she had truly heard before the silence took hold. Vela, her true name, spoken with such fierce, protective love. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in 18 years, she pushed against the silence with everything she had, every ounce of trust and sacrifice and hard-won understanding the Wildwood's trials had given her. The sound that emerged was faint at first, barely more than a breath, but it was sound, real and undeniable, the first she had produced since childhood. She felt something crack deep within her, not painfully, but with the particular relief of a long-held breath finally released. I am here, she said, her voice rough and unfamiliar to her own ears but growing steadier with each word. I do not come to command you through force. I come because I have finally remembered who I am, and I believe, if you are willing to listen, that you already sense the truth of it. The wolves went very still, their ears pricked forward, their attention absolute. Alira felt something shift in the air around her, a subtle but undeniable pull, similar to the one that had guided her through the darkness of the first trial. Except now, it seemed to move outward from her, rather than toward her, reaching toward the assembled pack. My name is Viola, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, carrying a weight and resonance she had never possessed before. Something ancient and undeniable, woven into every syllable. I am the last of the Emberwolf line, hidden for 18 years, silenced to protect me from those who feared what my bloodline could become. I do not ask for your obedience. I ask only that you recognize what already exists between us. The largest wolf among them, a great gray creature with scars marking one side of its face, stepped forward slowly, its dark eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten with anticipation. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved, predator and unlikely commander studying each other across the narrowing distance between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, the great wolf lowered its head and bent its front legs, kneeling in the tall grass of the valley floor. One by one, the rest of the pack followed, lowering themselves in the same deliberate gesture of recognition and submission, until every wolf in the clearing knelt before her, their eyes never leaving her face. Elira, no, Vela, stood in the center of that kneeling pack, her own voice still echoing faintly in her ears, tears streaming freely down her face. She had done it. The trial was complete, the final piece of her stolen inheritance restored. She sank slowly to her own knees, amid the kneeling wolves, overwhelmed by the weight of everything the past several days had given her. A voice, a true name, a bloodline she had never known she carried, and now, undeniable proof that everything Etta had told her was true. When she finally made her way back up the outcropping, her legs still trembling with exhaustion, Etta was waiting exactly where she had left her, and the old woman's expression, upon seeing Vela's face and hearing the soft, wondering sound of her own breathing, broke into something Illyra had not yet seen from her: open, unguarded joy. "Say something," Etta urged softly. "I want to hear it for myself." Vela opened her mouth, her voice still rough and unfamiliar, but undeniably present, and spoke the first words she had chosen to say to another person in 18 years. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing I was worth saving." Etta's eyes filled with tears of her own, and she pulled the younger woman into a fierce, careful embrace. "You saved yourself, child," she said quietly. "I only opened the door. You were the one brave enough to walk through it." They stood together at the edge of the outcropping as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, and Vela looked out over the valley, where an entire pack of wild wolves had just knelt before her, feeling, for the first time in her remembered life, that she finally understood exactly who she was meant to become. The trials were complete, but she understood, even in that moment of hard-won triumph, that they marked only the beginning of a much longer road ahead, one that would eventually lead her back toward the kingdom that had cast her out, and toward the king who had signed her banishment without ever once looking her in the eye. Word travels strangely through a kingdom, passed hand to hand and mouth to mouth, until the truth at its center becomes almost unrecognizable. It began with a single trader who claimed to have seen a woman walking calmly through the wildwood, with a wolf pack trailing peacefully behind her, close enough to touch, obedient as trained hounds. He told the story at a tavern near Vermore's southern gate, half convinced no one would believe him, and was surprised when 3 separate travelers came forward within the same week claiming similar sightings. By the time the story reached the royal court, it had grown considerably in the telling. Some said the woman commanded not just wolves but the very trees of the forest, bending them to her will. Others whispered that she was building an army in secret, gathering followers from among the scattered rogues and outcasts who lived beyond Vermore's borders, preparing for an uprising against the crown. Damien Ashgrave heard the rumors first from Lord Garrick, who delivered them with the particular relish of a man eager to prove his own political instincts correct. "A rebellion forming in the wildwood, my king," Garrick said, standing before the throne, with his hands clasped behind his back. "Rogue wolves gathering under some self-proclaimed leader. If the reports are to be believed, it would be wise to address this before it grows into something more troublesome." Damien sat forward slightly, a familiar tightness settling into his shoulders, the same tension that had accompanied nearly every decision he had made since taking the throne 3 months prior. He had inherited a kingdom that expected strength above all else, and every choice he made was filtered through that expectation, whether it aligned with his own instincts or not. "Send scouts," he said finally. "I want confirmation before I commit any real resources to this. Rumors from travelers are hardly reliable intelligence." Garrick's mouth tightened slightly, clearly hoping for a more decisive response, but he bowed and withdrew, to arrange the scouting party regardless. The scouts departed within 2 days, 5 experienced trackers, chosen specifically for their skill in navigating difficult terrain and reporting back accurately on what they found. Damien expected their return within a week at most. 3 weeks passed with no word at all. By the time the scouts finally returned, Damien had grown genuinely concerned, less about any supposed rebellion, and more about the fate of 5 men he had personally sent into unfamiliar territory. When they finally appeared at the palace gates, disheveled but unharmed, he called them before the throne immediately, eager for a full accounting of what had delayed them so significantly. What he received instead left him deeply unsettled. The lead scout, a steady, unflappable man named Corwin who had served the crown for over a decade without a single mark against his record, stood before the throne with an expression Damien had never seen on him before, something close to reverence, entirely unlike the practical, unromantic demeanor Corwin typically carried. "We found her, my king," Corwin said. "Deep in the wildwood, in territory none of us had explored before. She is no rebellion leader gathering forces against the crown. She is something else entirely. Something I confess, I do not fully understand even now, weeks after witnessing it myself." "Explain," Damien said, his patience already fraying at the edges. "She commands the wolves of the wildwood without force, without weapons, without any visible coercion at all," Corwin continued. "They follow her the way a pack follows its true alpha, absolute and unquestioning. When we approached her camp intending to assess the threat and report back, she met us without any show of aggression whatsoever. She simply spoke, and—" Corwin paused, searching visibly for words adequate to describe what he had experienced. "My king, I have served this kingdom loyally for 11 years. I have never once considered abandoning that service. And yet, standing before her, hearing her voice, I felt an almost overwhelming urge to kneel, to offer her the same loyalty I have always given the crown. I do not understand it, but I cannot deny it either." The other 4 scouts, standing silently behind Corwin, nodded in solemn agreement, their expressions carrying the same unsettled reverence. Damien felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the throne room. In all his years observing the political maneuvers of Vermore's council and the various threats that periodically emerged from its borders, he had never once heard a report quite like this. "Did she give a name?" he asked, though something in his chest already dreaded the possible answer, though he could not have explained why. "She called herself Vaela," Corwin said. "Last of a bloodline she named the Ember Wolves, though none of us had heard the name before encountering her. She said—" He hesitated again. "She said the crown of Vermore already knew her, though under a different name. She would not elaborate further, only ask that we deliver a message directly to you, my king, and no one else." Ladamian's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the arms of his throne. "What message?" Corwin met his gaze steadily. "She said to tell you that silence, once broken, does not forgive easily, and that you should prepare yourself, because she intends to return to Vermore before the season turns." The throne room fell into heavy, uncertain silence following Corwin's words. Damien sat very still, his mind racing through every silent, unremarkable omega he had ever signed away, every banishment decree he had approved without a second thought during his brief and difficult reign. The particular phrasing of the message, "silence broken, once broken does not forgive easily," struck something deep and uncomfortable in his memory, though he could not yet place exactly why. Lord Garrick, who had been listening with growing alarm throughout Corwin's report, stepped forward decisively. "This confirms exactly what I feared, my king. A rebellion is forming, led by someone with genuine power to challenge the crown's authority. We cannot afford to wait and observe further. I recommend assembling the full royal army and marching on the wildwood before this threat grows beyond our ability to contain it." Damien wanted to object, some instinct deep within him, rebelling against the idea of marching an army against a single woman, however strange and powerful her reported abilities might be. But the weight of the crown, and the expectations that came with it, pressed heavily against that instinct. "Assemble the battalion," he said finally, the words feeling wrong even as he spoke them. "We march within the week." The preparations moved quickly after that, the full weight of Vermore's military machinery, grinding into motion with practiced efficiency. Soldiers polished armor and sharpened weapons. Horses were readied. Supply carts loaded with provisions for what the council anticipated might become an extended campaign against whatever forces this mysterious Vaela had gathered in the wildwood. Damien found himself increasingly troubled as the preparations continued, an unease he could not fully articulate even to himself. He thought often of the message Corwin had delivered, "Silence once broken does not forgive easily," and found himself, in quiet, unguarded moments, trying to recall the faces of every silent omega he had ever encountered during his short reign. One name kept surfacing in his memory, though he pushed it away each time it emerged. Illyra, the mute woman he had banished during his very first month as king, the sentence he had signed without ever once lifting his eyes from the scroll before him, too consumed at the time with the overwhelming weight of his new responsibilities to spare more than passing attention to the fate of a single, unremarkable omega. He told himself it could not possibly be the same woman. Illyra had been silent, powerless, entirely unremarkable in every way the council had described her. The Vela described in Corwin's report commanded wolves through voice alone, carried herself with an authority that had shaken 5 experienced, battle-hardened scouts to their core. And yet the unease would not leave him, no matter how firmly he tried to dismiss it. On the morning the battalion finally departed Vermore's gates, marching north toward the Wildwood under Damien's own command, he found himself glancing back once at the Great Hall, where he had signed countless decrees during his brief reign, wondering, with a growing dread he could not fully explain, exactly what waited for them in the depths of that ancient forest. Whatever it was, he understood with grim certainty that it would change the course of his kingdom, and quite possibly his own life, in ways he was not yet prepared to face. The Royal Battalion reached the edge of the Wildwood 4 days after departing Vermore, nearly 300 soldiers strong, their banners bearing the silver wolf of the crown, snapping crisply in the cold northern wind. Damien rode at the head of the column, his expression carefully composed, despite the persistent unease that had followed him the entire journey. They made camp at the tree line the first night, and Damien found himself unable to sleep, staring up at the dark canopy of branches overhead, listening to the distant, occasional howl of wolves somewhere deep within the forest. He thought of Corwin's report again, of the strange reverence in the scout's voice as he described the woman who commanded an entire pack through presence alone. He thought too, despite his best efforts not to, of Alira's face in the moment before the guards led her away, the way she had turned toward the throne as though hoping, even after everything, that he might finally look up and meet her eyes. He had not. He had kept his gaze fixed firmly on the scroll before him, telling himself it was simply easier that way, that a king could not afford to feel the weight of every difficult decision too personally. He wondered now, lying awake in his tent at the edge of an ancient and unfamiliar forest, whether that had been cowardice rather than wisdom. The battalion moved deeper into the Wildwood the following morning, following the rough path Corwin's scouting party had marked during their earlier expedition. The forest grew denser and more disorienting with every mile, the towering trees blotting out much of the pale winter sunlight, until the entire column moved through a strange, perpetual twilight that put even the most seasoned soldiers on edge. By mid-afternoon, they reached the edge of a wide clearing, and Corwin, riding near the front alongside Damien, raised a hand to signal a halt. "This is close to where we encountered her before, my king," he said quietly. "I would advise caution from here." Damien nodded, studying the clearing ahead with wary attention. It appeared empty at first glance, nothing but grass and scattered stone, the same peaceful, unremarkable forest they had been traveling through for the past 2 days. But something in the stillness of it felt deliberate, watchful, as though the clearing itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. They advanced slowly into the open space, the battalion spreading out into a loose defensive formation behind their king, weapons ready but not yet drawn, uncertain exactly what threat, if any, they were preparing to face. She appeared at the far edge of the clearing, without any warning at all, simply present, where a moment before, there had been only empty grass and shadow, as though she had stepped directly out of the forest's own fabric. She wore simple traveling clothes, unremarkable in every visible way, and carried no visible weapon of any kind. But the moment Damien's eyes settled on her face, every carefully composed expectation he had built during the journey shattered completely. It was her. Alira, the mute Omega he had banished during his first month as king, standing now at the edge of an ancient forest clearing with an authority radiating from her presence so palpable it felt almost physical, striking every soldier in the clearing with the same unsettling force at once. "Hold formation," Damien called out, though his voice came out rougher than he intended, betraying more of his internal shock than he wished to reveal in front of his assembled troops. She began walking toward them, unhurried, entirely unafraid, and Damien watched in growing disbelief as the soldiers nearest her path began, almost involuntarily, to lower their weapons. "What is this?" he demanded, though the question was directed more at his own shaken certainty than at any of the men around him. "Hold your positions." But the order seemed to carry no weight against whatever force radiated from the approaching woman. One by one, starting with the soldiers closest to her, and spreading outward through the ranks like ripples across still water, men began to kneel, their weapons lowered, their heads bowed, entirely without conscious decision on their own part. Damien sat frozen atop his horse, watching his entire battalion, nearly 300 trained, loyal soldiers, sink to their knees before a single unarmed woman who, 3 months prior, he had personally exiled from his kingdom for the crime of being silent and inconvenient. She stopped a short distance from where he sat, looking up at him with an expression that held no visible anger, no triumph, only a steady, unreadable calm that unsettled him more deeply than open hostility ever could have. "Hello, Damien," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the now silent clearing. The sound of her voice, a voice he had been told, repeatedly and with absolute certainty, did not exist, struck him with a force nearly as physical as the sight of his kneeling army. He had signed her banishment believing, without ever truly questioning it, that she was exactly what the council had described, weak, unremarkable, a burden the kingdom was better off without. The woman standing before him now, commanding the unconditional deference of his entire battalion through voice and presence alone, was clearly nothing of the sort. "You can speak," he said, the words emerging before he could stop them, foolish and obvious even as he said them. "I can," she replied simply. "I always could, in a sense." The voice was simply hidden, protected, until I was ready to reclaim it. She glanced briefly at the kneeling soldiers surrounding them, then back up at Damien, still mounted, and now visibly the only person in the entire clearing who had not knelt. "It seems your army disagrees with whatever assessment led you to exile me in the first place." Damien dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, in a way that had nothing to do with the long journey. He approached her carefully, acutely aware of every eye in the clearing watching the exchange, though most of those eyes remained respectfully lowered toward the ground. "I did not know," he said quietly, the admission costing him more than he expected. "I signed the decree without truly looking at what I was signing. That is not an excuse. I understand that now." Something flickered across her face at his words. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a small acknowledgement that he had at least spoken the truth, rather than offering some hollow justification. "My name is not Alira," she said. "Not truly. It is Vela, the name my mother gave me before she died protecting the secret of what I am. I am the last of a bloodline your council feared enough to see silenced generations ago, though I do not believe they ever knew precisely who I was when they cast me out. To them, I was simply an inconvenient omega, easier discarded than questioned." Damien absorbed this slowly, the full weight of what he had done settling over him with crushing clarity. He had not simply exiled a powerless, unremarkable woman on the recommendation of a fearful council. He had banished the last heir of an ancient and powerful bloodline, someone capable, apparently, of commanding absolute loyalty from an entire royal battalion without lifting a single weapon. "What do you intend to do?" he asked, bracing himself for whatever answer might follow. He had, after all, led an armed force into her territory with the stated intention of subduing what his council believed to be a rebellion. If she wished to claim some measure of retribution now, few in that clearing would be capable of stopping her. Vela studied him for a long, silent moment, and Damien found himself holding his breath, uncertain what verdict she was about to deliver. "I do not intend to harm you or your soldiers," she said finally. "That would serve nothing beyond satisfying an anger I have already chosen to release. But I do intend to return to Vermore, Damien, and I intend to speak, at last, about exactly what happened to me, and to how many others like me, under the rule of a council that has spent generations discarding anyone they deemed inconvenient, rather than understanding them." Damien felt something in his chest loosen slightly at her words, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. Whatever judgment awaited him, it seemed she intended to deliver it through truth and accountability, rather than violence. "Then let me escort you back myself," he said. "Whatever needs to be said to the council, whatever needs to change within this kingdom, I would rather face it directly than continue pretending, as I have for the past 3 months, that signing decrees without truly seeing the people affected by them is any way to rule." Vela regarded him for a long moment, weighing something in his expression that he could not fully read. Finally she nodded, once, the same small, deliberate gesture Alira had once given Rowan at the border of this very forest, a gesture that had meant, in its own silent way, "Thank you for seeing me." "Then let us go," she said. "Vermore has a great deal to answer for, and I intend to make certain it finally does." Behind them, the kneeling soldiers began, slowly and uncertainly, to rise, watching their king and the woman he had once exiled walk together back toward the edge of the clearing, toward a reckoning neither of them could yet fully predict, but which both of them understood, with growing certainty, was long overdue. The return to Vermore took 4 days, the battalion moving at a slower, more subdued pace than the confident march that had carried them into the wildwood less than a week earlier. Word traveled ahead of them regardless, carried by scouts and messengers, so that by the time the column came within sight of the kingdom's walls, a crowd had already gathered along the road, eager to witness for themselves whether the rumors sweeping through the countryside carried any truth. Vela rode near the front of the column, not as a prisoner, but as an honored presence, a fact that Damien had insisted upon despite quiet murmurs of discomfort from several of his officers. She wore her simple traveling clothes still, though Etta had insisted before their departure on adding a cloak dyed deep amber, the color of the stone that had helped guide Vela's memory back to her during that first crucial night in the old woman's cottage. The crowd along the road fell into uneasy silence as the column passed, whispers rippling outward as recognition spread. Many remembered the silent Omega who had once scrubbed floors and mended clothes throughout the kingdom, who had been marched out through the northern gate in chains not 4 months prior. Few had expected to see her return at all, let alone riding beside the king himself with an unmistakable air of quiet authority. Nora stood near the front of the gathered crowd, her hands pressed to her mouth in open astonishment as Vela passed. Their eyes met briefly, and Vela offered the older woman a small, genuine smile, silently promising a fuller reunion once the more pressing business of the day had been resolved. The council had assembled in the great hall by the time the column reached the palace, word of their approach having given ample time for preparation. Lord Garrick stood at the center of the raised platform, flanked by the same 6 council members who had presided over Vela's original sentencing, their expressions ranging from wary curiosity to poorly concealed alarm. Damien led Vela into the hall himself, the assembled crowd of nobles and palace staff parting before them in uncertain silence. He mounted the platform first, taking his place upon the throne, though he did not sit, choosing instead to stand beside it, a small but deliberate signal that today's proceedings would differ significantly from the formal judgments typically delivered from that seat. "Lord Garrick," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "you will recall the sentencing of a woman named Alira, 4 months past, on charges of weakening the pack's bloodline through her presence alone." Garrick's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, though he maintained his composed expression. "I recall it, my king. She has returned," Damien continued, "under a different name, and with a truth this council failed entirely to recognize during her original judgment. I believe it only right that she speak for herself now, given the opportunity none of us afforded her the first time." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the assembled crowd. Garrick's composure cracked slightly further, his eyes narrowing as he studied Vela with new, wary attention. Vela stepped forward to the center of the hall, the same spot where she had once stood bound and silent while her fate was decided entirely without her input. This time, she stood unbound, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried through the hall with a clarity and strength that left no doubt whatsoever about her ability to be heard. "My name is Vela," she began, "last surviving heir of the Emberwolf bloodline, a lineage this kingdom's ancestors feared enough to hunt nearly to extinction generations ago. I was silenced as a child, not through any weakness of my own blood, but through a protective curse my mother wove with her final breath, sacrificing everything to hide me from those who would have seen me destroyed for what I was." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle fully over the assembled council before continuing. "This council labeled me an Omega, weak and unworthy, based on nothing more than my inability to speak. You did not investigate the cause of my silence. You did not consider that a mute child found wandering the forest half-frozen, wearing a pendant belonging to a bloodline you had perhaps forgotten still existed, might carry a story worth understanding, rather than a burden worth discarding. You simply decided, based entirely on convenience and unfounded assumption, that I was lesser, and you cast me out accordingly." Lord Garrick shifted uncomfortably on the platform, opening his mouth as though to offer some defense, but Vela continued before he could speak. "I do not stand here today seeking vengeance," she said, her gaze sweeping deliberately across each member of the council in turn. I stand here because I have learned, through trials this kingdom knows nothing about, that silence is not weakness, and difference is not danger. I stand here to ask this council a single question. How many others has this kingdom discarded over the years, simply because their strength did not fit within the narrow boundaries this council found convenient to recognize? The hall fell into heavy, uncomfortable silence. Several council members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recalling other judgments delivered over the years, with similarly little consideration for the individuals affected by them. I have reviewed the records myself in preparation for this moment, Vela continued, her voice steady and unwavering. In the past decade alone, this council has banished 11 individuals under similarly thin justification, each labeled Omega, each dismissed as weak or burdensome, each cast out without genuine investigation into the truth of who they actually were, or what they might have offered this kingdom had they been given the chance. Damien, standing beside the throne, felt the full weight of this revelation settle over him with growing unease. He had known, in some vague and distant way, that the council's judgments over the years had been harsh, but he had never truly examined the pattern Vela now laid bare before the entire hall. I propose, Vela said, turning to address Damien directly now, that this kingdom reconsider entirely how it treats those it deems different or inconvenient, not through cruelty disguised as tradition, but through genuine understanding and fair judgment. I propose a formal review of every banishment issued under this council's authority, and the opportunity for those still living to return, should they wish it, without further condemnation. Lord Garrick, finally finding his voice, stepped forward with visible indignation. "This is preposterous," he said sharply. "The council's judgments have maintained the strength and purity of this kingdom for generations. We cannot simply undo decades of careful governance based on the claims of a single woman, however unusual her circumstances may be." "Careful governance," Vela repeated, her tone carrying a quiet, cutting edge that silenced the murmurs beginning to spread through the hall. "Is that truly what you would call it, Lord Garrick? Or would a more honest accounting describe generations of fear-driven decisions, made by a council more interested in protecting its own comfortable authority than in genuinely serving the people of this kingdom?" Garrick's face reddened with barely contained anger, but before he could respond, Damien stepped forward, his own voice carrying newfound authority as he addressed the hall directly. "I have spent the past 4 months signing decrees I did not fully understand, trusting the judgment of a council whose motivations I failed to properly examine," he said. "I will not continue ruling that way. Vela's proposal will be enacted, effective immediately. Every banishment issued under this council's authority will be reviewed, and this council's structure itself will be reformed, to ensure such careless judgments are never again delivered, without genuine consideration for the people affected by them." The hall erupted into a mixture of stunned murmurs and cautious approval. The palace staff and gathered nobles clearly divided on how to receive such a significant and unexpected shift in the kingdom's governance. Lord Garrick and several of his fellow council members exchanged alarmed glances, their long-held positions of comfortable authority suddenly, dramatically threatened. "You cannot simply dismantle generations of tradition on the word of a single woman," Garrick said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I can," Damien replied firmly, "and I will, because tradition that causes needless suffering is not worth preserving simply because it is old." He turned to look at Vela directly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression for the first time since she had re-entered his life. "This kingdom owes you an apology far greater than words alone can offer. I intend to see that it receives more than words, starting today." Viola held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for the sincerity behind his declaration, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed him. The council's power, built over generations on fear and convenient dismissal of anyone deemed inconvenient, had begun, in that single dramatic afternoon, to finally, irrevocably crumble. The weeks that followed brought more change to Vermore than the kingdom had seen in generations. Lord Garrick and 2 of his closest allies on the council resigned within days of the Great Hall confrontation, unwilling to remain under a system that no longer permitted the quiet, unquestioned authority they had grown accustomed to wielding. The remaining council members, chastened and genuinely shaken by the truths Vela had laid bare before them, threw themselves into the promised review, with an earnestness that surprised even Damien. Of the 11 individuals banished over the past decade, records showed that 6 had survived their exile and could be located. Messengers were dispatched to each, carrying formal invitations to return, along with genuine apologies and the promise of fair reconsideration should they choose to accept. 3 ultimately returned, their stories, once finally heard in full, revealing patterns of fear and convenience, disturbingly similar to Vela's own experience. Nora wept openly when Vela finally visited the kitchens, pulling her into a fierce embrace that lasted long enough to draw curious glances from the other kitchen staff. "I always knew there was more to you than they claimed," Nora said, wiping at her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I am only sorry it took the entire kingdom this long to see it too." Rowan, still serving among the palace guard, sought Vela out during one of her early days back, standing somewhat awkwardly before her, until she smiled and gestured for him to speak freely. "I meant what I said at the border," he told her. "I never believed what they claimed about you. I am glad, more glad than I can properly express, that you found your way to becoming exactly who you were always meant to be." Vela thanked him sincerely, understanding now, with the clarity her reclaimed voice afforded her, exactly how much his small kindness at the border had mattered during the darkest hour of her exile. Etta, too, eventually made her way to Vermore at Vela's invitation, though the old woman insisted she would never fully trust city walls, after so many decades living freely within the wildwood. She took up residence in a small cottage near the palace gardens, close enough to advise Vela regularly on matters concerning the reclaimed Emberwolf bloodline, far enough to retreat to genuine peace and quiet whenever the demands of court life grew too wearisome. Damien, for his part, dedicated himself with unexpected diligence to the broader work of reforming the kingdom's governance. He spent long hours in careful discussion with Vela, seeking her counsel not simply on matters directly related to her own bloodline, but on the wider question of how Vermore might build a system of judgment that valued genuine understanding over convenient assumption. Their relationship, forged first through the terrible circumstances of her exile, and then rebuilt through weeks of difficult, honest conversation, gradually shifted into something neither of them had fully anticipated. Where once there had been only the cold formality between a king and the Omega he had carelessly discarded, something warmer and more genuine slowly took root, built on mutual respect earned through hard, deliberate effort rather than simple circumstance. "I do not offer you my throne," Damien told her one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens beneath a clear, star-filled sky. "I understand now that such an offer would only replace one form of careless assumption with another, presuming you would want a crown simply because I have one to give. What I offer instead is partnership, freely chosen, built on genuine equality rather than any hierarchy of power." Vela considered his words carefully, recognizing in them the significant growth he had undergone since the day he signed her banishment without ever meeting her eyes. "I would rather build something new alongside you," she said finally, "than simply inherit something old that was never truly built to include people like me in the first place." Together, over the months that followed, they began reshaping Vermore's governance into something genuinely different, a system built on careful investigation rather than convenient dismissal, on understanding rather than fear. The old council structure was gradually replaced by a broader body of representatives drawn from across the kingdom's various communities, ensuring that decisions affecting people's lives would never again be made so carelessly, so entirely without genuine consideration for those most directly impacted. Vela herself took on a role unlike any that had existed before in Vermore's history, neither queen nor council member exactly, but something closer to a guardian of fair judgment, her reclaimed authority as the last Emberwolf heir, lending genuine weight to a role focused specifically on ensuring the kingdom's mistakes were never repeated. On the day the reformed council was formally established, the entire kingdom gathered in the Great Hall, where Vela had once stood bound and silent, awaiting a sentence delivered without any genuine consideration of who she truly was. This time, she stood at the center of the hall not as someone judged, but as someone helping to reshape the very foundation of how judgment would be delivered going forward. Damien stood beside her, and when he spoke to the assembled crowd, his voice carried the genuine humility of a king who had learned, through significant personal failure, exactly what true leadership required. 4 months ago, he said. I signed away the life of a woman I never truly looked at, trusting a system built on fear and convenient assumption, rather than genuine understanding. That failure very nearly cost this kingdom something irreplaceable, and I will carry the weight of that mistake for the rest of my reign. But today, because of her extraordinary strength and her willingness to return to a kingdom that failed her so completely, we have the opportunity to build something better. He turned to look at Vela, and the crowd, sensing the significance of the moment, fell into respectful, attentive silence. Today, Vermore does not simply ask forgiveness, he continued. Today, Vermore commits itself to becoming a kingdom worthy of housing people like her, people the old system would have discarded without a second thought, but who carry, if we are only willing to look closely enough, strength and worth beyond anything convenient assumption could ever have predicted. The hall erupted into genuine, heartfelt applause, entirely unlike the uncomfortable murmurs that had once accompanied Vela's original sentencing in that very same space. She looked out over the gathered crowd, seeing familiar faces among them, Nora, Rowan, Corwin, and the other scouts who had first discovered her true nature in the depths of the wildwood, and felt something settle fully into place within her chest, a sense of belonging she had never once experienced during her 18 years of silent servitude within these same walls. She thought, in that quiet, triumphant moment, of her mother's final desperate act of protection, of Edda's patient guidance through trials that had demanded everything she had to give, of the long, painful journey from silent, discarded Omega to the woman now standing at the center of a kingdom finally, genuinely committed to change. The wildwood had given her back her voice, but more than that, it had given her back the truth of who she had always been meant to become. Someone strong enough not simply to survive rejection, but to transform it into the foundation for something far greater than the kingdom that had once cast her aside could ever have imagined. Vermore had banished a silent Omega, believing her weak and unworthy. What returned instead was someone an entire royal army had knelt before without hesitation, someone who had chosen, even with every justification for vengeance readily available to her, to build rather than destroy. And as the applause continued echoing through the great hall, Vela understood, with quiet, unshakable certainty, that this was only the beginning of everything her reclaimed voice and her hard-won strength still had left to build.